He was a millionaire in a cheap cap, hands sheathed in gloves that didn't belong to him, and a name whispered into his chest, Marcos. At 5:47 a.m., the swipe of an ID card and the scent of coffee and detergent braided together in a locker room no guest ever saw. Behind a row of lockers, a cracked phone screen lit up with a child's doodle, and a voice, soft, urgent, small, said a promise the owner had not budgeted for. Beatriz folded sheets with the precision of someone who had learned to make order out of chaos, because the world around her rarely did. She moved through the staff room like someone performing a ritual, apron tied, badge clipped, hair pinned. Her hands were familiar with the rhythm of starched linen and the stubborn curl at the edge of a pillowcase. She checked the time, then the drawing stuck with tape to the inside of her locker, a crude sun crowned with Laura's uneven letters, and kissed the ink as if it were a talisman. The drawing was wavy, the colours a little smudged from being carried in a small backpack, but there was a helmet drawn next to the sun. Beatriz smiled at that helmet because Laura wanted to be an astronaut, and for the moment the thought of outer space made morning light feel less heavy. Outside, the city uncoiled. The air was humid, a faint hiss of last night's rain clinging to the pavement. The hotel facade glittered under sodium lamps. Beyond the glass, chandeliers reflected in 1,000 tiny lights, and someone in a suit moved with the indifferent urgency of someone whose every minute could be charged. Inside, in the narrow space reserved for employees, where the coffee machine always tasted too strong, and the radio was forever stuck between two stations, Beatriz dialed a number, her breath held like a note waiting for release. "Hi, minha filha," she said, voice soft like an apology. "Yes, today is the day. I know, I promised." Her fingers tightened on the phone as if the plastic could contain her. "I will be there, Lau. I swear I'll be there for your birthday, no matter what." Those last words dropped into the locker room air. They were ordinary, maybe even cliched, until Gabriel Almeida heard them. He was standing by the water heater, like someone who belonged there. Cap low, hands folded, a shadow among the shadows. He hadn't meant to be in the service locker at that hour. He told himself he wanted to breathe the building's first light, to feel what the machines felt before guests arrived. In his mind it was research, hands-on stewardship of the thing he inherited. He told himself he was being practical, but when Beatriz's promise landed, plain and human, the same promise he'd been juggling in spreadsheets and perfunctory corporate memos, something in him lost its balance. Gabriel's life was a succession of controlled rooms, boardrooms with glass walls where whiteboards bloomed with lines and angles that meant profit, a downtown apartment with an espresso machine he never learned to calibrate properly. His father's portrait in the study, a mapped-out ancestry of expectations. He knew numbers the way other people knew names. He could tell you the occupancy trends for the last 5 years as if reciting a poem, and he would have trouble remembering the barista's name who made his morning latte. He owned the hotel company the way someone owns a map, familiar with the borders but not the terrain. He was supposed to be in a meeting that morning. Renato had emailed him at 3:12 a.m. with an agenda labeled optimization. The subject line had the precise, unromantic tone of upper management, staffing ratios and payroll adjustments. There were spreadsheets attached, percentages that argued for efficiency, margins that would satisfy investors. But his hand had hesitated on the lamp switch. At 4:30 a.m., the city made itself small and quiet and accessible. He had put on the cap because he wanted to feel anonymity. He had told himself he would remain a watcher, like a statistician behind glass. Beatriz's promise made it personal. He should have left then and there. He should have gone to the boardroom and put one more box on a slide and told the shareholders the right, measured things to say. Instead, he lingered. He saw how her voice softened when she said, "I will be there." And he felt, in a place he rarely visited, the weight of that promise, the policy-level cost of a day off, the arithmetic of overtime denied, the tiny accumulative debts families like Laura's carried like secret ledgers. It was a ledger that did not appear on his spreadsheets. The locker room smelled of strong coffee and floor cleaner. The fluorescent light stung a little. Beatriz hung up the call and turned toward the rows of carts being lined up like obedient beasts. Her shoulders were steady. Gabriel felt suddenly intrusive, like someone who'd nudged a portrait and watched it tilt. He had seen labor before, in numbers, in charts, in memos. He had seen the neat column labeled staff costs shrink and expand with commerce, and he had made decisions in meetings that were abstract and efficient. But the tone in Beatriz's voice as she promised Laura did something to the abstraction. The ledger gained a face, a cough, and a bedtime story. Across the street, the boardroom existed in its own climate, air-conditioned and decisive. Gabriel had been there the week before, listening to Renato present projections. Renato's manner was brisk, practiced. If we adjust the night service schedule, we can reduce overtime by 12%. Renato, who had risen through the hotel's ranks, who knew how to translate operational stress into acceptable numbers, looked at the screen and then at Gabriel with the equilibrium of someone who had learned to separate consequence from feeling. In a way, Renato was a necessary lens. He was the manager who had to balance compassion with solvency. He had his own emails about budget constraints, about unions at the other hotels, about a parent who had recently been late with rent because overtime had been capped. This disconnect between the glass rooms and the utility rooms was what Gabriel had promised himself he'd learn. He had arranged an early walkthrough that morning, an excuse he would tell the board, anthropological study. He wanted to see the unseen. He wanted to be a better steward. What he did not anticipate was that the unseen would be speaking about a child's birthday and that those words would catch him off guard like a physical collision. Beatriz moved through the first floor like someone who could map a room with touch. She smelled of soap and lemon. The creak of her shoes spoke the language of stairwells and service corridors. She greeted Jessica, who was already folding towels on a plastic chair, and they exchanged the kind of weatherless pleasantries that carry the freight of shared shifts. Laura's drawing peeped from under Beatriz's wallet as she reached into her apron for a pen. Someone left a radio on low. A samba instrumental tucked itself behind the hiss of a faucet. There is a kind of dignity in that chorus. Small exchanges like countersinking rivets, ordering the day into a workable machine. When she collected the cleaning cart and began to wheel it out, she didn't notice Gabriel at first. He was a shadow near the tiles, cap pulled, notebook abandoned. He had told himself absurdly that being present would be enough to understand. He did not know how to move without turning those observations into judgments he had no right to make yet. He felt like an anthropologist who had accidentally fallen in love with his subject's humanity. "Don't forget the East Wing," Jessica called, and Beatriz nodded. "Laundry on second floor, and Laura, make sure she drinks water," Jessica added with a softness that made the instructions sound like a prayer. Beatriz's cart rattled through the service corridors, the wheels leaving a small percussion on the hard floor. The carts were a city's rhythm section: linen, towels, discarded chocolates from the minibar, the ghost crumbs of guests' late dinners. In rooms, she checked for small defects as if inspecting a child's homework, a smudge on the mirror, a thread missing on a pillowcase. Her work had a forensic quality to it. Her eyes catalogued everything that could be set right before it became a complaint. Gabriel followed at a distance at first, his cap barely catching the light. He watched how Beatriz's hands moved, quick, exact, never wasteful. And he watched how staff avoided direct eye contact with guests in the corridors, trained to be visible and invisible at the same time. There were economies of motion there. The hotel demanded a kind of erasure of personal need. When a guest sneezed, towels appeared. When a meeting was scheduled for 7, coffee makers hummed at 6. When a child had a fever, the parent who worked at the hotel found themselves making choices that yielded immediate quantifiable losses: unpaid days, missed bonuses, depleted savings. By the time Beatriz reached room 1214, Gabriel could feel the hum of machinery in his chest. He listened to the soft, almost ritualistic sounds of her work: spritz of cleaner, the flap of linen, the low murmur of the building waking up. He had never noticed the way the echo in a hallway swallowed sound, and memory the way a river swallows a thrown stone. At noon, the hotel's lobby became a stage for polished shoes and whispered deals. But at dawn, the staff corridors were a different city, smaller and more intimate. Gabriel found himself drawn to it with an urgency he could not fully articulate. He drafted memos in his head and then tore them up. He thought about giving Beatriz a raise. He thought about setting up a fund for emergency days. He thought about changing schedules to prioritize parents. All of those things were possible, he knew. Yet he also felt the nervousness of someone who realized that good intentions travel poorly across institutional logics. He had learned, so had Renato, that the margin between sustainability and benevolence was thin. He made a choice then that would complicate the ledger further. Instead of returning to the boardroom, he walked to the small supply closet and borrowed an old doorman's cap and a reflective vest that smelled of someone else's day. He found an ID badge that read Marcos in block letters, anonymity in print, and for the first time since his father's funeral, he felt the vertigo of being unmoored from his name. He thought the cap might allow him to see without being seen, to test the water without producing ripples. The plan was clumsy in the way quiet rebellions often are. Gabriel would not announce himself. He would observe, he would learn, he would make notes. He told himself it was a limited experiment. One morning, one shift. He rehearsed the script in his head. Be helpful. Be invisible when necessary. Ask neutral questions. But the cap pinched in a new way under his ears. The vest felt slightly foreign across his chest. When he walked out into the service corridor, people nodded politely, but didn't stop to chat. The protocol of the staff was not to create obstacles for each other. If he wanted data, he would have to be patient. He had not expected to stand in the narrow light of a low-slung bulb and overhear a private promise. He had not planned for Beatriz's voice to move from the locker room radio into his chest, like an address. Yet promises have a way of turning algebra into accusation. When she said, "I will be there," she was speaking to her daughter, but the sentence hung in the space between them and rearranged something. Gabriel felt a quickness in his breathing, a sense of being called to account by a domestic contract he had never signed. It made him think of his own cancelled promises, to his sister, to his father's legacy, to himself. The developer's mind loves margins. The human heart keeps receipts. He spent the rest of that morning drifting, a ghost who could not read his own handwriting. He watched Beatriz carry 3 bags of soiled linen as if she were hauling the day's worth of small compromises. He watched her laugh with Jessica when a towel disappeared and then reappeared in the most comedic of places. He watched her tap the drawing of the astronaut on the ID card with a finger absent-mindedly, as if touching the future could make it respond. At one point she sat on the step outside the staff exit for a minute, head bowed, lips moving in a mantra, and Gabriel thought she might be praying. He did not know the words. It was in the basement pantry, over a sandwich he had not asked for, and that tasted like an attempt at normality, that he first felt the name Marcos settle into him. A maintenance worker nodded in his direction and said, "Morning, Marcos," as if they had shared 100 dawns together. Gabriel answered because it felt easier than telling the truth. He would hold the name until it became a tool, he told himself. The first week was reconnaissance wrapped in guilt. He clocked in as a doorman, received a uniform that didn't fit, and learned the choreography of opening doors for late guests and ferrying luggage with an efficiency he had never needed to acquire. He learned the small signals sent between staff, a discreet hand at the back of a chair, an eye contact that spoke of empty pockets. He learned that the service elevator had a smell of stale soap and metal springs, and yet was the axis on which guests' comforts turned. On the elevator rides between floors, he observed faces he might otherwise have discounted. A woman with permanent lines around her mouth, a man with calloused hands who had once been a chef, a teenager with a tattoo half hidden under a shirt sleeve. Each one carried a story that did not appear on his quarterly reports. He watched payroll runs in the back office, briefly as a visitor who had not yet claimed the authority to stay permanently, and saw how a missed shift became a small fissure in a life. There were names on the attendance sheet that had been circled in red. There were notes: sick, childcare, transportation. Each notation was a calculation of risk. He began to catalogue them as though he were inventorying something precious. He sent tentative emails to HR about flexible scheduling for parents and got back guarded replies reminding him of budget constraints. One afternoon, Renato pulled him aside. The hotel manager carried a rain-streaked clipboard and the practiced reserve of someone whose job required him to keep the ship from listing. "Gabriel," Renato said, using the name he had been taught to use in public, "we appreciate the walkabout, but changes to schedules ripple. If we guarantee days off for parents, we have to be careful. Labor law, union agreements, there's precedent to follow. We can't make promises we can't fund." Gabriel listened, and for the first time he heard not just the argument, but the fear behind it. A fear of losing balance, of being held responsible for disruptions only partially within his control. Renato was not opposing kindness. Renato was practicing survival. The two men shared a language of constraints that had been built over years. Gabriel wanted to tell him that constraint could be bent, that the ledger had leeway. He did not. Instead, he felt the truth that institutions slow change when a single person acts. Back in the narrow staff corridors, Beatriz hummed as she worked. She had a way of inserting kindness into the smallest crevices, cutting the crust off a colleague's sandwich, saving a tiny bar of soap for a co-worker's daughter, slipping extra fruit into Laura's lunchbox when Beatriz could afford to. She had not told her mother how much she being paid. Discussing money in her family felt like airing an intimate injury. Her mother, practical and sharp-eyed, gave her sources of good advice and a small suitcase of reminders. You have to ask for your days. You have to write it down. No one will notice you unless you make them notice you. Laura, 5 and relentless, lived in a small rented room that smelled of butter and the leftover perfume of good intentions. She drew spaceships and suns and astronauts, training her mind toward a horizon that did not yet know how to measure wages. Her birthday was a small, sacred event, a cake bought at a corner bakery, candles that cost a little more than the moment allowed, and the absolute need for her mother to be present. For Beatriz, the promise to Laura could not be quantified. It was a debt she was proud to carry. When Laura's school sent a note about the birthday party, and the party was to be at 11 on a Saturday, Beatriz promised herself she would be at the park with a paper crown and a cheap balloon. To attend meant forfeiting a day's wage if her schedule did not allow it. To be absent was an immediate, palpable loss. Less money for the bus, for the milk, for the tiny luxuries that stitched a child to normality. Gabriel watched the ledger of that moral equation unfold before him in micro-moment after micro-moment. A missed day, a late bus, an unpaid dinner. At night, when he would wash the uniform off his palms and return to his apartment, the drawing of the sun would blink at him behind Beatriz's badge on his desk, for he had inexplicably pocketed the photocopy of Laura's drawing he saw, taped inside Beatriz's locker. He would not admit why he kept it. He told himself he kept it as a totem. He told himself he would translate his empathetic outrage into policy. He began to test the limits of his authority in small ways. He emailed HR, signed proposals, and then watched as the administrative language swallowed his ideals. There were clauses, contingencies, and legal team footnotes. The company could afford to increase some benefits, but there was a diplomatic choreography required. Negotiate with the board, secure budget approval, pilot the program at one hotel before rolling it out company-wide. The power he wielded in a meeting room was not the same power he would wield in a ledger. The transformation he sought would require patience, negotiation, and, he realized with a pang, accountability. Between his tentative memos and Renato's cautious counsel, Gabriel made a mistake born of haste and shame. He leaked a partial promise, a whispered suggestion to housekeeping that management might be more open to discussing parent-friendly scheduling. It was a clumsy, unofficial olive branch. The staff heard it, there was hope, but the hope was fragile and uncorroborated. Rumors blossomed in the corridors like mushrooms after rain. People asked each other half-questions. Trust, as he would learn, is not a switch that can be flipped with a rumor. When Beatriz heard a co-worker mention the owner who wants to help, she smiled but remained measured. She had seen managers come and go. She had seen programs announced with great fanfare and then reduced to footnotes within months. Her trust had a history that required cautious investment. Nevertheless, something had shifted. She felt an undercurrent of attention that had nothing to do with charity and everything to do with acknowledgement. 2 days after the overheard promise, there was a small crisis. Laura woke in the night with a fever so fierce, her small body shivered against feverish blankets. Beatriz sat by her, forehead pressed to the child's hair, and spent the night oscillating between work and the hospital's emergency line. The next morning, Beatriz called her manager to say she would not be able to come in, sick child. The reply was automatic, a policy repeated like a litany. Please submit a doctor's note for paid leave. Otherwise, it will be recorded as an unexcused absence and will affect your day's pay. The policy shielded management from arbitrary erosion of rules, but also placed the burden of proof on the person in need. For a mother like Beatriz, taking a child to a clinic meant paying for transport and waiting, and sometimes for medication. It meant forfeiting wages for hours tied to a shadow economy of gig work. She made the call. Laura slept in the crook of her arm. The child's small, feverish fingers curled around a scrap of tissue. Beatriz sent her son's father's phone, a picture of his daughter pale and sleeping. The father texted an absent sympathy. Gabriel heard about the absence as a ripple in his morning. A single marked unexcused on a sheet of attendance seemed to him suddenly obscene. He felt with the concentrated force of someone who had watched the numbers bend lives into shapes that the system had failed a promise before it had had a chance to be tested. He tried, clumsily, and with the zeal of a novice, to use his temporary anonymity to make a difference that would not be mistaken for paternalism. He slid an envelope with a modest amount of cash, no more than what might cover a bus and a vet bill, into the staff mailbox labelled for Beatriz, and he left it there with palms sweating. He watched from the stairwell as she opened the mailbox, and when her fingers touched the paper, they trembled. She looked around, scanning faces as if expecting someone to have noticed. The envelope's presence was like a small, invasive kindness. It solved an immediate problem, but also raised questions. Who had the right to give? Who would be expected to return gratitude? Was help a commodity that required gratitude to validate it? The receipt of the envelope did not make her indebted. It made her alert. She checked the note inside, an unsigned wish for well-being, and folded it into her apron. Beatriz did not ask who had left it. She did not post about it. She lived in a world where small mercies were practical, not dramatic. But that envelope lodged a thought in her mind. Someone had seen without her asking to be seen. Gabriel watched from a distance and felt the peculiar shame of someone who had not dared show his name. He had not meant his anonymity to do harm, yet the act itself was a transgression of another sort. He had chosen to give without disclosing the power dynamics that underlay the gift. There are ways to be generous that preserve dignity. There are ways to intrude that displace autonomy under a veneer of generosity. The incident pressed on a tender place in him. He realized that to enact real change, he could not simply be an anonymous Samaritan dropping cash into mailboxes. He needed to confront the ledger with the human faces attached to each line item. He needed to step out of the cap and name himself. The thought of revealing his identity made his palms sweat in a different way, sweat born of fear of being seen for the deception he had already committed by remaining unknown. But before he could do that, he had to learn more. He wanted to know whether a single owner could write policy without the machinery of administration misreading it. He wanted to know how a decree from a man in a boardroom translated into the daily arithmetic of a mother checking the clock between shifts to get to a birthday party. He wanted to see, up close, the friction that turned intention into compromise. And so he kept the cap for a while longer. That week, Gabriel made small, accidental intimacies. He helped a porter rearrange a stack of luggage and listened to stories about unpaid tuition. He handed Beatriz a cup of coffee and watched her accept it with a nod that did not ask why. He began to tally in his head things that money alone could not fix. Consistent schedules, predictable days off, someone trained to cover emergencies without turning the absence into a punitive ledger. He drafted memos to the board, then erased them and rewrote them with a quieter temperament. He was learning a slow grammar, patience, negotiation, and the humility of being wrong. Beatriz, for her part, continued to be complete even in her own unbroken fracture. She did not frame her life as tragic. She framed it as necessary. She loved in small, careful increments, preparing leftover cake for Laura's school, saving the wrapper of a sticker because Laura liked the colors. When another mother on shift called out asking for a favor, a swap of a weekend shift so she could attend a parents' evening, Beatriz considered the calendar and said yes. She kept a list in her head of the things she could make correct and the things she could not. The hotel at dawn and dusk hummed on without grand proclamations. Guests complained about small things. They never saw the ledger of someone else's absence taped to the back of a door. Gabriel realized that to do right by the staff, he would have to translate his unease into institutional movement. But to do that without crushing dignity, he would also have to reconcile the dishonesty of his current position. The day he finally decided to act, it rained hard. A city wash that makes light look soft and cruel at once. He watched Beatriz and the team hustle against the downpour, the cart slick with water and the staff's shoes spattered with mud. He thought about the day Laura was to celebrate her birthday in the park and how a sudden downpour could ruin a child's party and an adult's carefully laid plans. He thought about the way a lost day's wage accumulates into a story that ends poorly. He walked into the manager's office without the pretense of cap and vest. Renato looked up and measured him with the professional wariness of someone accustomed to unscheduled entrances. Gabriel sat down and, with a breath, used the word "we" in a way that felt less like appropriation and more like a plan. He spoke about scheduling pilots, parental priority, and a modest phased increase for those with caregiving responsibilities. He did not promise an immediate revolution. He did not offer vouchers or grand gestures. He offered instead a process. Audits, pilot programs, negotiations with union representatives. Renato listened, and somewhere between his careful nods and strategic pauses, Gabriel saw the kernel of a way forward that might actually survive the legal team's scrutiny. Gabriel felt the particular thrill of authority being used with restraint. But when he suggested, in the very meeting that would begin change, that he would like to tell the staff himself that he intended to meet them to present the plan, Renato looked at him with an odd mixture of respect and caution. "Walk us through how you'll do it," Renato said, "and remember, surprise can be destabilizing. People need to know the facts, not a show." The moment called for balance, and Gabriel felt its weight. He thought about stepping into the staff room and saying, "I am Gabriel Almeida, and this will change things." He thought about the radical transparency of that admission, and about the ways in which it might undo trust as much as build it. Was it right to reveal his deception by weaponizing truth? Would the confession heal the wound he had already opened by acting anonymous? He did not answer that day. He left the meeting with reinvigorated authority and a conflict lodged like a splinter under his skin. He kept the cap in his bag. He would need to decide whether to remain masked a little longer or to pull off the fabric of disguise and be accountable in the light of day. That evening he walked back through the service corridor where Beatriz was locking up a cart. She looked up and caught his eye, and in that quick tilt of seeing, he felt a fissure open between intention and action. If he revealed himself now, he'd be revealing not only his name, but the fact that he had listened in on nights and lunches and the moment of a promise that had nothing to do with him. The truth felt inescapable and heavy. He placed the cap on his head again, because the cap offered him an easier identity to sustain for the moment. He told himself he would be careful. He told himself he would use the cap to gather facts before he spoke truth. He did not yet admit the other, sharper truth. He wanted to be near Beatriz, not only to know her work, but to see the way she kept her promises. He wanted to witness a life that he had created, in part, from the distance of a ledger. 2 days later, in the pre-dawn locker room that smelled of lemon and scalding coffee, Beatriz ducked under the humming light and leaned into the locker to pull out Laura's birthday crown. She smoothed the paper with a reverence that could have been mistaken for ritual. She dialed a number and spoke with a voice threaded with small triumph. "It's tomorrow. I will be there at 11, she said. "I promised, and I'm coming." Gabriel, standing by the heater with his cap on, felt the sentence like a bell. He had heard it before. He had heard it as a lesson. He had heard it as a weapon that exposed how his world and hers could be bridged by something as simple and as stubborn as a promise. He did not leave then. He listened because he wanted to learn what the promise meant to her and why it carried such cost. The confession, her vow, arrived thin and crystalline in the early morning air, and it lodged in him. It was not theatrically melodramatic. It was a domestic ordination. It demanded response. It made the invisible visible. He pressed his palms to his cap as if steadying himself against a tide. The hotel was full of protocols, of policies that favored consistency over serendipity, of a discipline that rewarded the preservation of a balance sheet more than the preservation of a promise. But there, in a narrow locker room, among the discarded shoe-polish tins and a calendar of employee birthdays, Gabriel understood that his own promises, to be a steward, to make his father's name mean more than profit, were insufficient unless they entered the messy, exacting domain of real lives. He made a choice in that quiet which, once chosen, could not be entirely reversed. He decided to remain as Marcos, at least for a time, to learn the margins, to be a witness to what a missed day's pay could look like for a family. He would, he told himself, convert discomfort into policy. He would risk the deception for the sake of knowledge he claimed was necessary. He did not consider then how that deception might fracture trust when it came to light. As he walked out to the staff entrance with a bag of guest umbrellas he was supposed to return to Lost and Found, he noticed the way Beatriz folded Laura's drawing into a pocket and slid the crown into a lunchbox. He thought of the birthday the way one thinks of a fragile thing. It required care, proximity, and time. He stepped outside into the first pale wash of morning and felt the cap under the slight press of rain. The street smelled like wet asphalt and exhaust, but also like possibility. He held the umbrella to steady a guest's luggage, smiling a cautious practice smile. He was in that moment both imposter and owner, neither comfortably. He had crossed a line he would have to explain, or fail to explain, later. Inside the staff room, Beatriz brushed her hair and stuffed the paper crown into her bag, tucking the drawing into the fold as if it were a map. She had no idea of the man under the cap who now watched the entrance, who had, for a week, been cataloguing the soft costs of being a parent in a low-wage job. She simply had a promise to keep, and promises ask more of people than circumstances like to give. Gabriel lingered for a beat, counting the ways the ledger would shift if he were to speak his name. He thought of Renato, of the boardroom, of shareholder patience. He thought of Beatriz's fingers pressed to the drawing of an astronaut. He thought of Laura's small crown and the way a child's belief could insist that the world keep its part of the bargain. Then he straightened the cap, ran a hand over the badge that read Marcos, and pushed open the heavy service door that led to the street. The morning breathed, and, somewhere inside the building, a child was waking to the possibility of her mother keeping a promise. The choice he had made, temporary and furtive, set in motion a series of consequences he had not yet measured. If this story pulls at you, a like helps us tell more true-to-life tales about people whose work keeps the world running. The morning he decided not to hide anymore began with rain easing into a thin, embarrassed drizzle. Gabriel walked through the staff entrance without his cap tucked low, without the reflective vest that had become a kind of second skin. The corridor smelled of damp uniforms and the sharp bite of industrial cleaner. The noise level was the same as always, trolleys squeaking, a radio somewhere playing a soft bolero. But everything felt slightly louder, as if silence had been pulled tight and was now loosening. He had rehearsed the admission in the privacy of his own car. A simple sentence, a name, an explanation laced with accountability. He imagined Renato's brow creased and the legal team ready with clauses. He imagined Beatriz folding her arms and saying the hard things she had a right to say. He imagined being refused, and he imagined, too, the rare possibility of beginning to make amends in a way that respected dignity rather than paternalism. When he pushed open the staff room door, faces turned, not with theatrical curiosity, but the quiet attention that comes from people who habitually measure strangers by the width of their intentions. Jessica smiled out of reflex. A few heads nodded, an economy of gestures cultivated to keep the work moving. Gabriel felt both the height of the room and the narrowness of his own admission. "I need to say something," he said, and for the first time he used the full weight of his own voice in that small space, without cap or pretense. They listened because the hotel, for all its bureaucracy, was also a place where speech translated into schedules, and schedules decided whether food would be bought for a child. He told them his name, Gabriel Almeida, and he told them why he had been hiding as Marcos. He did not soften the deceit. He explained it plainly, curiosity that became voyeurism, empathy that had not yet learned how to partner with institutional procedure. He acknowledged the envelope he had left in a mailbox, and the ways that anonymous charity can shame as much as it helps. There were immediate ruptures. Someone breathed a laugh that was not quite a laugh. A woman with a tired face who had been with the hotel for 12 years said, "So the owner was standing in our way for a week and calling it research?" It was a sharp remark. It landed like a stone. Beatriz said nothing at first. Her hands were folded around a paper cup, the ridges indenting her skin. Gabriel had not expected to be met with a united chorus of hurt. He had expected a director's nod, and perhaps an eyebrow of annoyance. He had not expected the lived register of betrayal, the sound of people who keep their dignity close to their ribs, to be startled into the open. Renato stood in the doorway, a figure whose job was to hold operations steady. He had insisted on being there. The hotel manager had a look of tired respect. He had spent nights balancing budgets, and he recognized a man attempting to use the power of his position to make things right, but he also knew that right actions required legal scaffolding. "I won't pretend this was handled correctly," Gabriel said. "I made a mistake. I thought I was learning. I thought badly, that I could do it from the margins. I should have come here. I should have listened without a mask. I'm asking for your patience, not your pardon." "Patience?" Jessica asked. "You think patience is what we need? We need a schedule that doesn't punish a mother for a fever. We need someone to pick up the job of being human around here." Her voice was even, but it cut. It was the sound of someone used to making precise demands and being thwarted by euphemisms. Beatriz looked at Jessica, then at Gabriel. There was a simmer of anger in her eyes that had nothing to do with theatricality. It was the kind of hot, practical anger that demands a list of remedies. "Promises are promises," Beatriz said, and the words were small and exact. "You listened to me talk about my daughter and her birthday instead of listening to our coordinator when she had a problem. You did not come to us. You hid. So now what?" Gabriel took the question seriously. He had practiced humility in corporate meetings, where humility is often a curated posture. In this small room, his posture had to be true. "What I am proposing is a pilot," he said. "A negotiated, transparent plan that starts here. A modest raise for those with caregiving responsibilities. Negotiated, measurable, sustainable. A guaranteed weekly rest day that prioritizes parents where possible. A small emergency fund so that a parent's absence does not mean going hungry the next day. And audits, independent checks, so that this isn't just words." He named percentages and timelines because the staff had learned to respond to numbers. They wanted to know whether hope had the architecture to last. He proposed a phased 5% uplift for caregivers at this hotel initially, with board approval contingent on metrics and a limited budget impact analysis. He proposed that the scheduling pilot be limited to one wing of the hotel for 3 months, with data to assess feasibility, and that the hotel match a small portion of voluntary staff contributions to seed the emergency fund. It was not an extravagant plan. It was not meant to be. It was designed to be possible. Renato listened, and his face shifted from caution to calculation. "We can look at reworking the schedules," he said slowly. "We'd need to engage HR, check compliance with labor law, and present to the board for budget approval. A pilot is sensible, but this can't be unilateral." "Of course not," Gabriel said. "I will sign whatever agreements are necessary. I will commit the resources, but only with structured accountability. I will accept oversight." Silence moved through the room like a current. The staff exchanged glances. There was a realism that had to be honored. Commitments require follow-through, and the staff had seen management commit and then be eroded by expense reports and the ever-whispered market conditions. Beatriz's answer was not immediate. She had learned that promises sometimes arrive like late buses, and that the one who makes the promise cannot always be trusted to catch them. She wanted terms, not theatrical apologies. "If this pilot happens," she said, setting the cup down very carefully, "then there needs to be transparency. I will be on the committee. Jessica will be on it. We need to see the numbers. We need to be able to request a review if things change." "You will," Gabriel said. "I want you to lead it if you'll accept." She considered his offer as if he had presented her with two things at once, danger and possibility. There was a wary respect beneath her caution. "I don't sign until I see the first month's payroll," she said, "and I want a written commitment that there will be no retaliation for those who asked questions." Gabriel nodded. The terms were not for his convenience. They were for their safety. He accepted them. He added, and I will attend the staff meetings regularly, not as an owner issuing edicts, but as a participant in this committee. The meeting concluded with a series of pragmatic next steps. HR would draft a pilot proposal. The legal team would outline compliance issues. The board would be approached with a realistic budget projection, and a committee including staff representatives would be formed. It was, in other words, the slow, unspectacular machinery of repair. Outside the staff room, the city had shifted into a clearer day. Gabriel felt a dull pressure behind his ribs, the peculiar strain of someone who had just granted their authority to being examined. He had expected relief after telling the truth. Instead, he felt a new responsibility that could not be shrugged off with a check. Word spread through the hotel in measured ripples. Some staff expressed cautious optimism. Others adopted the posture of those who have seen promises bloom and wither. Jessica was quietly supportive, practical, skeptical, but willing to engage. Renato was precise and anxious. He kept asking about sustainability models, retention metrics, training budgets. Gabriel met each question with plans and a willingness to be accountable. The decision to include staff in the negotiation was crucial. The pilot's terms were shaped by people who would live the changes. Beatriz insisted on transparent payroll lines so that any uplift could be followed. She requested an internal hotline to report scheduling conflicts without fear. She wanted commitment in writing that the pilot would be evaluated by an external auditor at the end of 3 months. Her demands were not theatrical. They were rooted in survival. Negotiations with the board were slower than Gabriel liked. He found himself in conference rooms arguing not about compassion, but about employee turnover costs, customer satisfaction scores, and reputational risk. He learned to translate human need into the architecture of a corporation. That was part of his job now, to make empathy legible to balance sheets. He sent copies of Laura's drawing in a private packet along with the pilot proposal, not as a lever, but as a reminder that the numbers represented lives. The board approved a modest pilot for the hotel, with a floor of 3 conditions. The program must be cost-neutral within a rolling 6-month horizon. It must demonstrate measurable improvements in staff well-being or retention, and it must have a clear exit clause for the company if the pilot jeopardized solvency. Those were fair demands. Gabriel accepted them. He felt the sting of constraint and the affirmation that sustainable change often lived within limits. The day Beatriz found out the pilot was approved, contingent as it was, she felt a rush of practical relief rather than overwhelming joy. Money was not the only thing she wanted. She wanted predictability. The idea that a doctor's note would no longer automatically mean unpaid leave for a parent in the pilot wing was small enough to be believable and large enough to matter. Yet beneath the professional agreements lurked a deeper wound, the breach of trust. The staff still remembered that Marcos had been, in fact, the man who set policies that decided their children's breakfasts. The reveal had been a betrayal in a more intimate register. Belonging in a workplace cannot be conferred by words alone. It must be lived. It was Beatriz who named this truth aloud. "I will look at the paperwork," she told Gabriel the afternoon after the proposal had passed. They sat in a small break area, a thin cafeteria table between them, the room scented with reheated stew and the caramelized odor of the bakery downstairs. "But your coming here, wearing that cap, listening in, was not okay. A promise from you needs to start with honesty." Gabriel listened. He did not offer excuses. He had tangled himself in a moral error, one he had to untangle by accepting Beatriz's terms, not to rush forgiveness, but to accept accountability. "I understand," he said. "You don't owe me forgiveness. I only can ask to be judged by what I do next." Beatriz gave him a look that was almost a smile, edged with weariness. "Then be judged," she said, "and be ready to be corrected." The story's next phase was not dramatic. It was a series of small procedural moments. Payroll lines changed. A program coordinator was hired to manage the pilot. Schedules were redrawn to create a parental priority matrix. The emergency fund was seeded with a modest initial amount from company reserves, matched by voluntary staff donations. They instituted a retroactive policy to allow for verified medical emergencies to be compensated pending documentation, a detail that reduced the immediate fear of losing a day's pay for parents. The program's administration consumed reams of forms, meetings, and patient emails. It was not the tidy, instantaneous fix of a hero's flourish. It was negotiation. It was tedium. It was necessary. In the weeks that followed, small improvements began to alter daily rhythms. A mother who had once worked weekend double shifts managed to swap and secure a regular weekend off. A new line in the payroll cleared an absence for a child's hospitalization. The anxiety of an unpaid day evaporated for that family, replaced by the weary relief of problem solved. Jessica, who had been skeptical, told Gabriel with a short laugh that seeing the payroll change felt strange, like a new tooth finally growing, painful but promising. But bureaucracy moves slower than trust. Beatriz's anger softened, not because memos arrived, but because she saw Gabriel repeatedly choosing to be present in administrative tasks that kept the pilot real. He sat in meetings with HR. He signed off on budget items. He authorized training for replacement staff, so absences would not lead to frantic overwork. She watched him accept a new layer of scrutiny, a board report he could not hide behind, and she checked the numbers he promised against the ones that arrived. Their relationship adjusted its orbit. It was not a romance in the cinematic sense. It was a negotiation between two people trying to avoid replicating the dynamics that had wounded them. Gabriel learned how to let go of paternal gestures. Beatriz tested him with small boundaries, no personal calls during shift, no dropping by her home uninvited. He respected each boundary, and in respecting them, he began to earn a kind of trust that no memo could formalize. There were awkward moments. Once, in a corridor, Gabriel reached to hand Beatriz a stack of labeled checklists he'd drafted to streamline room assignments for parents. She looked at him, then at the papers, and for a heartbeat he saw in her eyes the calculation that had kept her safe for years. Why would I accept help from you and then be beholden? He answered by offering the documents to the committee instead, insisting they be reviewed and approved by staff representatives. It was a small gesture, but it reflected a new humility. He would not gift them solutions. He would build them together. 2 weeks before Laura's birthday, Beatriz surprised him by handing him a simple invitation. She had not called it an invitation. She called it a test in a half-joke. She asked whether he would come to the park on Saturday morning. Not to hand out wallets, she said sharply, then softened. To be present, quietly. If you want to make any more promises to my daughter, you say them to me first. Gabriel accepted. He did not offer to bring flowers or the kind of extravagant present that would read as a purchase of affection. He bought a small, battered paperback about planets and stars, an introduction to astronomy for children. He wrapped it in paper with a careful hand, thinking about Laura's drawn astronaut and what it meant to keep a child's imagination safe. On the morning of the party, the park smelled of grass cut fresh and the faint metallic tang of the nearby playground. A few mothers clustered around a picnic blanket, folding chairs balanced precariously on the uneven ground. The cake was a simple thing with a smudge of blue icing where a hand had obviously drifted. Laura wore a paper crown that had been hastily colored. It sat on her head like a fragile coronation. Beatriz moved in a rhythm that made the small party a cathedral of domestic competence, arranging cupcakes, tying balloons, whispering instructions to a cousin who helped watch other children. When Gabriel arrived, he kept to the edge of the circle, hands folded in front of him, a presence rather than an intervention. He watched how Beatriz's attention was entirely on her daughter. She was both festival planner and boundary enforcer. She was, as always, meticulous. When Laura came bounding over and introduced Gabriel with the kind of blunt sincerity children possess, "This is the man who knows about stars," she said without ceremony, as if adults' complicated histories did not yet register on her moral scale. She accepted the book with an unself-conscious joy that undid something in the men who watched her, a softness that was not sentimental but necessary. Gabriel knelt to meet her eye. He handed the book into small, eager hands and read out the inscription he had written, trying for honesty rather than poetry. For Laura, may your curiosity always be noticed, from someone who learned how important it is to keep his promises. The inscription was a simple promise. It was not a check. It was not a bargain. It cost him nothing, and it cost him everything. He stayed through the party, helping to sweep up confetti, fetching extra juice boxes, and doing his best not to make his presence into a performance. Beatriz watched him from across the blanket with a guarded something in her face, an appraisal, an inventory of emotional costs and benefits. After the children had left and the paper crowns lay limp on the grass, Beatriz thanked Gabriel quietly. The words were small, but they carried weight. Not acceptance, not a full reopening, but recognition. "You came," she said. "You stayed. That's a start." "It is," he said, "and whatever comes next, I'll follow what you want." He did not expect her to invite him into a larger intimacy that day. He did not ask. Instead, the party marked a real threshold. Presence over grandiosity. In the months that followed, the pilot's administrative machinery continued to hum. There were meetings that stretched late into evenings, spreadsheets that were argued over like small battlegrounds. Staff surveys showed modest improvements in perceived fairness, and turnover in the pilot wing dipped slightly. There were also setbacks, an error in scheduling that led to an extra double shift for one person, a miscommunication about overtime that produced an angry morning. Each error required attention, apology, and a correction. The program did not erase friction. It gave the staff a channel to express it and a manager who could not pretend not to hear. Gabriel found himself spending time in the HR office, not as an owner issuing directives, but as someone learning how to be a partner in governance. He sat in a meeting with union representatives and listened, sometimes in silence, as they articulated legal constraints and fair demands. He accepted that his role was to facilitate, not to override. Renato, once wary, began to treat him as a colleague who had learned he could not simply buy goodwill. Beatriz's role in the new committee was active and precise. She kept minutes with an economy of language that made the meetings useful rather than theatrical. She raised questions about reporting structures and insisted on quarterly public disclosures of the pilot's data. She did not soften her voice for anyone. She also slowly allowed herself to accept small personal exchanges, a shared cup of coffee after a shift, a brief conversation about Laura's latest drawing. These moments were guarded, lacking in flourish, but they were real. Their evolving connection was not a tidy love story. It was a relationship built on the slow accrual of trust, consistent follow-through, transparent decision-making, and a willingness to be corrected without retreat. Gabriel learned hard and daily how to hold his place of privilege without turning it into a weapon or a comfort. Beatriz learned, equally hard and daily, how she might allow someone new into the margins of her trust without losing her sovereignty. Months later, when the pilot's initial 3-month assessment was held, a room full of managers, staff, and an external auditor, there was a moment when a live microphone asked Beatriz to speak. She did, with a voice that wavered only once. "We do not want charity," she said. "We want work that recognizes we are human. We want schedules that allow us to be mothers and employees. This pilot has not solved everything. It has made some things possible, and for that, we will keep watching and making sure it continues." Her words were not triumphant. They were practical and full of the resilience of people who had long learned to make the small things hold. When the auditor reported a slight improvement in retention and a measurable decrease in last-minute absences for childcare reasons, the room responded with a careful applause. The board took the results as cautious evidence to consider expanding the pilot to other hotels in a phased manner. Gabriel's relief was private and deep. It did not spare him from vigilance. There were also personal reckonings. One evening, Beatrice's mother came to see Gabriel in the lobby. They spoke in the kind of blunt terms elders use. No ceremony, only testable facts. She told him plainly what she thought about the man who had hidden and then told the truth. "You did right by taking responsibility," she said, "but remember, bread comes from work, not from promises. If you are going to help, help so that her work is safer, not just her holidays." Gabriel listened and promised he would. He did not promise anything he could not keep. He took the elders' words as a compass. Time, good administration, and a delicate humility can transform small policies into stable practices, and they can transform a relationship of suspicion into one of guarded cooperation. Gabriel continued to respect Beatrice's boundaries. He never asked for more than she was willing to give. He accepted that her forgiveness, if it came, would arrive in stitches, small acts sown over time. The hotel, too, changed its rhythms. The staff had a reliable way to handle emergency absences without every-time penalization. A new coordinator ensured replacement staff were scheduled proactively. The emergency fund helped a family replace a broken washing machine and cover a day's lost income without drama. These were not world-changing acts. They were the careful repair of a machine's parts, so people who powered it could breathe a little easier. On a quiet evening, as the winter light turned the hotel's facade to brushed metal, Gabriel found himself in the service corridor where it started months ago. He paused by the locker room and noticed a drawing taped inside a locker. A child's son, a scribbled astronaut, a crown. For a fleeting moment he felt the old vertigo, how quickly lives intersect when visible. He pressed his palm to the locker door without cap or pretense and walked on. He had changed, not into a savior, but into a person who understood that promises were not notes to be signed and filed. They were rhythms to be practiced. He did not imagine he had fixed every injustice in the hotel. He understood the limits of his role, but he had learned what it cost to make a promise and what it cost to keep one. Beatriz kept her promise to Laura that spring. The birthday's photograph, Laura with a crooked paper crown and a smear of icing, hung on her wall, a talisman of the ordinary sort. For Beatriz, the victory was not in the pilot's numbers, but in the way she had anchored a child's memory with her presence. For Gabriel, the victory was in the way he had learned to carry responsibility without turning it into spectacle. Their relationship moved forward with caution and newfound mutual respect. Coffee breaks became chances for exchange rather than assessment. A walk to pick up dry cleaning turned into a conversation about school supplies and the way the city rearranged itself at night. They remained from different worlds, but they chose, slowly and deliberately, to bridge a gap, not by rescuing, but by walking alongside. One afternoon, months after the pilot had begun, Gabriel found a small paper crown taped to a legal brief on his desk. Inside, a note in Beatriz's precise hand read, "You kept one of your promises. Keep the rest." He folded the paper into his wallet and carried it like a ledger of different sorts, one that recorded human commitments instead of profit margins. The hotel's corridors still hummed with the same work. Carts rattled, rooms were tidied, guests complained and praised in equal measures. But there was a new modest friction. A committee minutes sheet on a clipboard, a staff notice about the emergency fund, a schedule that sometimes allowed a parent to breathe. These were not cures for structural inequality, and no one pretended they were. They were, nonetheless, a set of changes that mattered in the small arithmetic of daily life. Beatriz's agency remained intact. She continued to make choices that prioritized her daughter and her dignity. Gabriel's authority was tempered by the committee and the reality that his role was to enable rather than dictate. There were moments when the balance faltered, miscommunications, policy errors, human fatigue, but the practice of repair had been established. On a cool evening, when the lights in the lobby threw long reflections across the marble, Gabriel stood by the window and watched a housekeeping cart roll down the service corridor. He thought of the first morning he had heard a promise that wasn't his. He thought of how the word Marcos had felt like a mask and how shedding it had been painful and necessary. He thought of Beatriz's small, fierce insistence on conditions and of Laura's unguarded smile. The last image the story leaves is not a tidy resolution, but a careful continuing. A woman with a child's drawing taped to her locker, a man who learned to name himself and to follow through, a workplace that began to change because the people inside insisted it should. There were no miraculous endings, only incremental human ones. Payroll lines adjusted, committee minutes taken, a child's birthday kept, and two people learning to trust actions more than words. He had come as a millionaire in a doorman's disguise, and left knowing that disguise could never substitute for responsibility. She had kept a promise that had cost, and in keeping it, she had opened a small space for a new kind of accountability. The hotel remained what it always was, a building that housed lives, but within it, some lives found a little more room to breathe. If this story moved you, leave a comment below. Who in your life deserves to be truly seen?